The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 10, Side 2. These formal treatises do not show him at his best. Like his plays, they gleam with epigrams, but these, sent forth page after page in a staccato jet, at last weary the mind and lose their charm. Seneca's public, however, read these essays at intervals and did not resent the gay wit that displeased the austere Quintilian, or the sugar plums and glaring patches that would offend Fronto's archaic taste. It was pleased that their rich premier spoke so amiably, and, like his pupil, tried so hard to win its applause. For many years, Seneca was the leading author, statesman, and vine-grower of Italy. He multiplied his patrimony by investments that apparently took full advantage of his official position and knowledge. If we may believe Dio, he lent money to provincials at such high interest that panic and insurrection broke out in Britain when he suddenly called in his loans there in the sum of 40 million sesterces. His fortune, we are told, rose to 300 million, or $30 million. In 58, an old delator friend of Messalina, Publius Swillius, publicly attacked the premier as a hypocrite, an adulterer, and a wanton, a man who denounces courtiers and never leaves the palace, who denounces luxury and displays 500 dining tables of cedar and ivory, who denounces wealth and sucks the provinces dry by usury. Like Caesar, Seneca contented himself with a rebuttal when he might have arranged an execution. In his essay On the Happy Life, he repeated the charges and replied that the sage is not bound to poverty. If wealth comes to him honestly, he may take it, but he must be capable of abandoning it at any time without serious regret. Meanwhile, he lived ascetically amid his fine furniture, slept on a hard mattress, drank only water, and ate so sparingly that when he died his body was emaciated through undernourishment. Abundance of food, he wrote, dulls the wits. Excess of food strangles the soul. The charges of sexual irregularity were probably true of his youth, but he was noted for his unfailing tenderness to his wife. In truth, he never made up his mind which he loved better, philosophy or power, wisdom or pleasure, and he was never convinced of their incompatibility. He admitted that he was a very imperfect sage. I persist in praising not the life that I lead, but that which I ought to lead. I follow it at a mighty distance, crawling. Of which of us is this not true? If he is not sincere in saying that mercy becomes no man so well as the king or the prince, he at least phrases the sentiment almost as well as Portia. He condemned gladiatorial combats to the death, and Nero forbade them. He disarmed much criticism by what Tacitus calls the grace with which he imparted wisdom. He did not demand, any more than he practiced, perfection. We have seen that he ruled the empire well, and that he tarnished his record by condoning the worst of Nero's crimes, letting much evil pass in order to have the power of doing a little good. He felt disgraced and longed to free himself from his imperial servitude. He described the emperor's palace as triste ergastulum, an unhappy prison for slaves. He began to wish that he had devoted all his life to the study of wisdom and had shunned the dark labyrinths of power. With pleasure he would put aside now and then the cares of politics, and at 60 attended like an eager youth the lectures of Metronax on philosophy. In the year 62, aged 66, he begged leave to resign his reduced place in the government, but Nero would not let him go. After the Great Fire of 64, when Nero asked all the empire to send contributions for the rebuilding of Rome, Seneca donated the greater part of his fortune. Gradually he succeeded in withdrawing from the court. More and more he lived in his Campanian villas, hoping by an almost monastic seclusion to escape the attentions and spies of the emperor. For a time he lived on wild apples and running water for fear of poison in his food. It was in this atmosphere of leisurely terror that he wrote, from 63 to 65, his studies in natural science, Questiones Naturales, and the most lovable of his works, the Epistulae Morales. They were casual, intimate causeries addressed to his friend Lucilius, rich governor of Sicily, poet, philosopher, and frank Epicurean. There are few books in Roman literature more pleasant than these urbane attempts to adapt Stoicism to the needs of a millionaire. Here begins the informal essay, which would be the favorite medium of Plutarch and Lucian, Montaigne and Voltaire, Bacon and Addison and Steele. To read these letters is to be in correspondence with an enlightened, humane, and tolerant Roman who has reached the heights and known the depths of literature, statesmanship, and philosophy. They are Zeno speaking with Epicurus's lenience and Plato's charm. Seneca apologizes to Lucilius for the carelessness of his style. It is nevertheless delectable Latin. I want my letters to you to be just what my conversation would be if you and I were sitting or walking together. I write this, he adds, not for the many, but for you. Each of us is sufficient audience to the other. Satis magnum alter alteri theatrum sumus. Though the old diplomat doubtless hoped that posterity would eavesdrop on his talk. He describes his asthma vividly, but without self-pity. He cheerfully calls it practicing how to die by taking last gasps for an hour. He is 67 now, but only in body. My mind is strong and alert. It takes issue with me on the subject of old age. It declares that old age is its period of bloom. He rejoices that he has time at last to read the good books he has had so long to put aside. Apparently he now reread Epicurus, for he quotes him with a frequency and an enthusiasm scandalous in a Stoic. He is frightened by the excesses of individualism and self-indulgence in Caligula, Nero, and thousands more. He wishes to offer some counterweight to the temptations that beset minds liberated before moral maturity, and he seems resolved to confute the Epicureans out of the mouth of the master whose name they abused and whose doctrine they dared not understand. The first lesson of philosophy is that we cannot be wise about everything. We are fragments in infinity and moments in eternity. For such forked atoms to describe the universe or the supreme being must make the planets tremble with mirth. Therefore, Seneca has little use for metaphysics or theology. One may prove out of his writings that he was a monotheist, a polytheist, a pantheist, a materialist, a Platonist, a monist, a dualist. Sometimes God is to him a personal providence who watches over all, loves good men, answers their prayers, and helps them by divine grace. In other passages, God is the first cause in an unbroken chain of causes and effects, and the ultimate force is fate, an irrevocable cause which carries along human and divine affairs equally, leading the willing and dragging the unwilling along. A like indecision obscures his conception of the soul. It is a finely material breath animating the body, but it is also a God dwelling as a guest in the human frame. He speaks hopefully of a life beyond death where knowledge and virtue will be perfected, and again he calls immortality a beautiful dream. In truth, Seneca has never thought these matters out to a consistent or public conclusion. He talks of them with the cautious inconsistency of a politician who agrees with everybody. He has followed too successfully his father's oratorical lessons and expresses every point of view with irresistible eloquence. The same hesitations mar and grace his moral philosophy. He is too stoic to be practical and too lenient to be stoic. He sees about him an immorality that exhausts the body and debases the soul, never satisfying either. Avarice and luxury have destroyed peace and health, and power has made man only an abler brute. How shall one free himself from this ignominious agitation? I read in Epicurus today, if you would enjoy real freedom, you must be the slave of philosophy. The man who submits to her is emancipated there and then. The body once cured often ails again, but the mind once healed is healed for good and all. I shall tell you what I mean by health. If the mind is content and confident, if it understands that those things for which all men pray, all the benefits that are sought or bestowed, are of no importance in relation to a life of happiness. I shall give you a rule by which to measure yourself and your development. In that day you will come into your own when you realize that the successful are of all men most miserable. Philosophy is the science of wisdom, and wisdom is the art of living. Happiness is the goal, but virtue, not pleasure, is the road. The old ridiculed maxims are correct and are perpetually verified by experience. In the long run, honesty, justice, forbearance, kindliness bring us more happiness than ever comes from the pursuit of pleasure. Pleasure is good, but only when consistent with virtue. It cannot be a wise man's goal. Those who make it their end in life are like the dog that snaps at every piece of meat thrown to it, swallows it whole, and then instead of enjoying it, stands with jaws agape anxiously awaiting more. But how does one acquire wisdom? By practicing it daily, in however modest a degree, by examining your conduct of each day at its close, by being harsh to your own faults and lenient to those of others, by associating with those who excel you in wisdom and virtue, by taking some acknowledged sage as your invisible counselor and judge. You will be helped by reading the philosophers, not outline stories of philosophy, but the original works. Give over hoping that you can skim by means of epitomes the wisdom of distinguished men. Every one of these men will send you away happier and more devoted. No one of them will allow you to depart empty-handed. What happiness and what a noble old age await him who has given himself into their patronage. Read good books many times rather than many books. Travel slowly and not too much. The spirit cannot mature into unity unless it has checked its curiosity and its wanderings. The primary sign of a well-ordered mind is a man's ability to remain in one place and linger in his own company. Avoid crowds. Men are more wicked together than separately. If you are forced to be in a crowd, then most of all you should withdraw into yourself. The final lesson of the Stoic is contempt and choice of death. Life is not always so joyful as to merit continuance. After life's fitful fever, it is well to sleep. What is baser than to fret at the threshold of peace? If a man finds life grievous and can leave it without serious injury to others, he should feel free to choose his own time and way. Seneca preaches suicide to Lucilius as if he were Lucilius's heir. This is one reason why we cannot complain of life. It keeps no one against his will. You have had veins cut for the purpose of reducing your weight. If you would pierce your heart, a gaping wound is not necessary. A lancet will open the way to freedom, and tranquility can be purchased at the cost of a pinprick. Wherever you look, there is an end to troubles. Do you see that precipice? It is a descent to liberty. Do you see that river, that cistern, that sea? Freedom is in their depths. But I am running on too long. How can a man end his life if he cannot end a letter? As for me, my dear Lucilius, I have lived long enough. I've had my fill. I await death. Farewell. Life took him at his word. Nero sent a tribune to seek his answer to the charge that he had plotted to make Piso emperor. Seneca replied that he was no longer interested in politics and sought nothing but peace and the opportunity to attend to a weak and crazy constitution. He showed no symptom of fear, reported the tribune, no sign of sorrow. His words and looks bespoke a mind serene, erect, and firm. "Return," said Nero, "and tell him to die." Seneca heard the message, says Tacitus, with calm composure. He embraced his wife and bade her be comforted by the honorableness of his life and the lessons of philosophy. But Paulina refused to outlive him. When his veins were opened, she had hers opened too. He called for a secretary and dictated a letter of farewell to the Roman people. He asked and received a drink of hemlock, as if resolved to die like Socrates. As the physician placed him in a warm bath to ease his pain, he sprinkled the nearest servants with the water, saying, "A libation to Jove the deliverer," and after much suffering he passed away, this in 65. At Nero's command, the physician forcibly bound Paulina's wrists and stopped the flow of her blood. She survived her husband a few years, but her perpetual pallor recalled her stoic resolution. Death glorified Seneca and made one generation forget his poses and his inconsistencies. Like all Stoics, he underestimated the power and value of feeling and passion, exaggerated the worth and reliability of reason, and trusted too much to a nature in whose soil grew all the flowers of evil as well as of good. But he made Stoicism human, brought it down livably within the scope of men, and formed it into a spacious vestibule to Christianity. His pessimism, his condemnation of the immorality of his time, his counsel to return anger with kindness, and his preoccupation with death made Tertullian call him ours, and led Augustine to exclaim, "What more could a Christian say than this pagan has said?" He was not a Christian, but at least he asked for an end to slaughter and lechery, called men to a simple and decent life, and reduced the distinctions between freeman, freedman, and slave to mere titles born of ambition or of wrong. It was a slave in Nero's court, Epictetus, who profited most from his teaching. Nerva and Trajan were in some measure molded by his writings and inspired by his example to conscientiousness and humanitarian statesmanship. To the end of antiquity and through the Middle Ages he remained popular, and when the rebirth came, Petrarch placed him next to Virgil and upon Seneca's prose devotedly modeled his own. Montaigne's brother-in-law translated him into French, and Montaigne quoted him as fondly as Seneca quoted Epicurus. Emerson read him again and again and became an American Seneca. There are few original ideas in him, but that may be forgiven, for in philosophy all truth is old and only error is original. With all his faults, he was the greatest of Rome's philosophers, and, at least in his books, one of the wisest and kindliest of men. Next to Cicero, he was the most lovable hypocrite in history. 5. Roman Science. Therefore, we have given him too much space. Nevertheless, we have not finished with him yet, for he was also a scientist. In those fertile years between his retirement and his death, he amused himself with questiones naturales, and sought natural explanations of rain, hail, snow, wind, comets, rainbows, earthquakes, rivers, springs. In his drama Medea, he had suggested the existence of another continent beyond the Atlantic. With similar intuition, contemplating the overwhelming multitude of stars, he wrote, "How many an orb, moving in the depths of space, has never yet reached the eyes of men?" And he adds, clairvoyantly, "How many things our sons will learn that we cannot now suspect? What others await centuries when our names will be forgotten? Our descendants will marvel at our ignorance." We do. Seneca, though always eloquent, adds little to Aristotle and Aratus, and borrows abundantly from Posidonius. He believes in divination despite Cicero, lapses into ludicrous teleology despite Lucretius, and interrupts his science at every turn to inculcate morality. He passes skillfully from muscles to luxury, and from comets to degeneration. The fathers of the Church liked this mixture of meteorology and morals, and made the Questiones Naturales the most popular textbook of science in the Middle Ages. There were a few men of scientific mind and interest in Rome, like Varro, Agrippa, Pomponius Mela, and Celsus, but they were scarce outside of geography, horticulture, and medicine. For the rest, science had not yet detached itself from magic, superstition, theology, and philosophy. It consisted of collected observations and traditions, seldom of fresh inquiry into facts, and rarely of experiment. Astronomy remained as Babylonia and Greece had left it. Time was still told by water clocks and sundials, and by the great obelisk that Augustus had stolen from Egypt and set up in the field of Mars. Its shadow, falling upon a pavement marked off in brass, indicated both the hour and the season. Day and night were variably defined by the rising and setting of the sun. Each had 12 hours, so that an hour of the day was longer and an hour of the night shorter in summer than in winter. Astrology was almost universally accepted. Pliny noted that in his time, AD 70, both learned and simple believed that a man's destiny was determined by the star under which he was born. They argued plausibly that vegetation and perhaps the mating season in animals depended upon the sun, that the physical and moral qualities of people are affected by climatic factors themselves determined by the sun, and that individual character and fate, like these general phenomena, are the result of celestial conditions inadequately known. Astrology was rejected only by the skeptics of the later Academy, who denied its pretended knowledge, and by the Christians, who scorned it as idolatry. Geography was studied more realistically, for navigation's sake. Pomponius Mela, in AD 43, published maps on which the surface of the globe was divided into a central torrid zone and north and south temperate zones. Roman geographers knew Europe, southwestern and southern Asia, and northern Africa. Of the remainder they had vague ideas and fantastic legends. Spanish and African skippers reached Madeira and the Canary Islands, but no Columbus rose to test Seneca's dream. The most extensive, industrious, and unscientific product of Italian science was the Historia Naturalis in 77 of Caius Plinius Secundus. Though busy nearly all his life as soldier, lawyer, traveler, administrator, and head of the Western Roman fleet, he wrote treatises on oratory, grammar, and the javelin, a history of Rome, another of Rome's wars in Germany, and, sole survivor of this flood, 37 books of natural history. How he managed all this in 55 years is explained in a letter of his nephew's. He had a quick apprehension, incredible zeal, and an unequaled capacity to go without sleep. He would rise at midnight or at 1, and never later than 2 in the morning, and begin his literary work. Before daybreak he used to wait upon Vespasian, who likewise chose that season to transact business. When he had finished the affairs which the emperor committed to his charge, he returned home to his studies. After a short light repast at noon, he would frequently in the summer repose in the sun. But during that time some author was read to him, from whom he made extracts and notes, as was his method with whatever he read. Thereafter he generally went into a cold bath, took a light refreshment, and rested for a while. Then, as if it were a new day, he resumed his studies till dinner, when again a book was read to him, and he made notes. Such was his manner of life amid the noise and hurry of the town. But in the country his whole time was devoted to study, except when he was actually bathing. All the while he was being rubbed and wiped, he was employed in hearing some book read to him or in dictating. In his journeys, a stenographer constantly attended him in his chariot or sedan chair. He once reproved me for walking. "You need not have lost those hours," he said, for he counted all time lost that was not given to study. His book, so sheared and sewn, was a one-man encyclopedia summarizing the science and errors of his age. "My purpose," he says, "is to give a general description of everything that is known to exist throughout the earth." He deals with 20,000 topics and apologizes for omitting others. He refers to 2,000 volumes by 473 authors and admits his indebtedness by name with a candor exceptional in ancient literature. He notes in passing that he found many authors transcribing their predecessors word for word without acknowledgment. His style is dull, though sometimes purple, but we must not expect encyclopedias to be fascinating. Pliny begins by rejecting the gods. They are, he thinks, merely natural phenomena, or planets, or services, personified and deified. The sole god is nature, that is, the sum of natural forces, and this god apparently pays no special attention to mundane affairs. Pliny modestly refuses to measure the universe. His astronomy is a galaxy of absurdities. For example, in the war of Octavian against Antony, the sun remained dim for almost a year. But he notes the aurora borealis, states with approximate modernity the orbital period of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn as respectively 2, 12, and 30 years, and argues for the spherical form of the Earth. He tells of islands rising from the Mediterranean in his time, and surmises that Sicily and Italy, Boeotia and Euboea, Cyprus and Syria were gradually sundered by the patience of the sea. He treats of the laborious and servile mining of precious metals and regrets that many hands are worn down that one little joint may be adorned. He wishes that iron had never been found, since it has made war more terrible. As if to bring death upon man more swiftly, we have given wings to iron and taught it to fly, referring to iron missiles equipped with leather feathers to help them keep their course. Following Theophrastus, he mentions under the name of anthracite a stone that burns, but says no more about coal. He speaks of an incombustible linen, called by the Greeks asbestos, which is used to embalm the cadavers of kings. He describes or lists many animals, lauds their sagacity, and tells how to predetermine their sex. If you wish to have females, let the dams face north while being covered. He has 12 wondrous books on medicine, i.e. on the curative value of various minerals and plants. Books 20 through 25 are a Roman herbal, which the Middle Ages passed down to form the initial plant lore of modern medicine. He offers cures for everything from intoxication and halitosis to a pain in the neck. He provides stimulants for the sexual passion, and warns women against sneezing after coitus, lest they abort there and then. He recommends coitus for physical weariness, hoarseness, pains in the loins, dim eyesight, melancholy, and alienation of the mental faculties. Here is a panacea rivaling Bishop Berkeley's tar water. Amid such nonsense occurs much useful information, especially about ancient industry, manners, or drugs, with interesting references to atavism, petroleum, and change of sex after birth. Mucianus informs us that he once saw at Argos a person whose name was then Eriscon, but had formerly been Erescusa, that this person had been married to a man, but that shortly afterward he developed a beard and other male characteristics upon which he took a wife. Here and there valuable hints occur. For example, Himley, in 1800, was led to investigate the action of Jusquiamus and Belladonna on the pupil by reading in Pliny a passage about the use of anagallis juice before operations for cataract. There are precious chapters on painting and sculpture, which constitute our oldest and principal account of ancient art. Pliny was not content with natural history. He wished also to be a philosopher, and throughout his pages he scatters comments on mankind. The life of animals, he thinks, is preferable to man's, for they never think about glory, money, ambition, or death. They can learn without being taught and never have to dress, and they do not make war upon their own species. The invention of money was fatal to human happiness. It made interest possible, by which some could live in idleness while others worked. Hence the rise of great estates owned by absentee landlords and the ruinous replacement of tillage with pasturage. Life, in Pliny's estimate, gives us much more grief and pain than happiness, and death is our supreme boon. After death, there is nothing. The natural history is a lasting monument to Roman ignorance. Pliny gathers superstitions, portents, love charms, and magic cures as assiduously as anything else, and apparently believes in most of them. He thinks that a man, especially if fasting, can kill a snake by spitting into its mouth. It is well known that in Lusitania the mares become impregnated by the west wind, a point missed in Shelley's Ode. Pliny condemns magic, but on the approach of a menstruating woman, he informs us, must will sour and seeds touched by her will become sterile, and fruit will fall from the tree under which she sits. Her look will blunt the edge of steel and take the polish from ivory. If it falls upon a swarm of bees, they will die at once. Pliny rejects astrology and then fills pages with prognostics derived from the behavior of the sun and the moon. In the consulship of Emicilius, and frequently at other times, it rained milk and blood. When we reflect that this book and Seneca's Questiones were the chief legacy of Roman natural science to the Middle Ages, and compare them with the corresponding works and temper of Aristotle and Theophrastus 400 years earlier, we begin to feel the slow tragedy of a dying culture. The Romans had conquered the Greek world, but they had already lost the most precious part of its heritage. 6. Roman medicine. They did better in medicine. Medical science, too, they borrowed from the Greeks, but they formulated it well and applied it ably to personal and public hygiene. Rome, almost surrounded by marshes and subject to mephitic floods, had particular need of public sanitation. About the 2nd century B.C., we hear of malaria in Rome. The Anopheles mosquito had settled down in the Pontine swamps. Gout spread as luxury increased. The younger Pliny tells us how his friend Cornelius Rufus suffered its pains from his 33rd to his 67th year before committing suicide, just to have the pleasure of outliving by one day that brigand Domitian. Some passages in the Roman satirists suggest the appearance of syphilis in the 1st century A.D. Great epidemics swept central Italy in 23 B.C., A.D. 65, 79, and 166. The people had of old tried to meet disease and plague with magic and prayer. Even now they begged the skeptical but complacent Vespasian to heal their blindness with his spittle and their lameness with the touch of his foot. They brought their illnesses and votive offerings to the temples of Aesculapius and Minerva, and many left gifts in gratitude for cures. But in the 1st century B.C. they turned more and more to secular medicine. There was as yet no state regulation of medical practice. Shoemakers, barbers, carpenters added it to their operations as they pleased, called in magic to their aid, and compounded, touted, and sold their own drugs. There were the usual satires and complaints. Pliny repeated old Cato's imprecations upon Greek physicians who seduce our wives, grow rich by feeding us poisons, learn by our suffering, and experiment by putting us to death. Petronius, Martial, and Juvenal joined in the assault, and a century later Lucian would score incompetent practitioners who hide their incapacity under the elegance of their apparatus. Nevertheless, medicine, as we shall see, made great progress in Alexandria, Kos, Tralles, Miletus, Ephesus, and Pergamum, and from these centers came Greek physicians who so raised the level of Roman practice that Caesar enfranchised the profession in Rome and Augustus exempted it from taxation. Asclepiades of Prusa won the friendship of Caesar, Crassus, and Antony. He declared that the heart pumps blood and air through the body, rarely prescribed drugs or drastic purges, and accomplished impressive cures by hydrotherapy, baths, fomentations, enemas, massage, sunshine, exercise, walking, horseback riding, diet, fasting, and abstinence from meat. He was distinguished for his treatment of malaria, his operations on the throat, and his humane handling of the insane. He gathered pupils about him and took some of them with him on his rounds. After his death, they and similar students formed themselves into collegia and built for themselves a meeting place on the Esquiline called Schola Medicorum. Under Vespasian, auditoria were opened for the teaching of medicine, and recognized professors were paid by the state. Greek was the language of instruction, as Latin is now the language of prescription, and for a like reason, its intelligibility to persons of diverse tongues. Graduates of these state schools received the title of medicus a republica, and after Vespasian they alone could legally practice medicine in Rome. The lex Aquilia provided for state supervision of physicians and held them responsible for negligence, and the lex Cornelia severely punished practitioners whose carelessness or culpable ignorance caused the death of a patient. Quacks continued, but sound practice increased. Midwives saw most Romans into the world, but many of these women were well trained. About A.D. 100, military medicine reached its ancient zenith. Every legion had 24 surgeons, first aid and field ambulance service were well organized, and hospitals were maintained near every important encampment. Private hospitals, valetudinaria, were opened by physicians. From these evolved the public hospitals of the Middle Ages. Doctors were appointed and paid by the state to give free treatment to the poor. Rich men kept their own physicians, and well-paid archiatri, or chief healers, took care of the emperor, his family, his servants, and his aides. Sometimes families would contract with a doctor to attend to their health and illnesses for a period of time. In this way, Quintus Stertinius made 600,000 sesterces a year. The surgeon Alcon, fined 10 million sesterces by Claudius, paid it with a few years' fees. The profession now reached a high degree of specialization. There were urologists, gynecologists, obstetricians, ophthalmologists, eye and ear specialists, veterinarians, dentists. Romans could have gold teeth, wired teeth, false teeth, bridgework, and plates. There were many women physicians. Some of them wrote manuals of abortion, which were popular among great ladies and prostitutes. Surgeons were divided into further specialties and seldom engaged in general practice. Mandragora juice or atropine was used as an anesthetic. Over 200 different surgical instruments have been found in the ruins of Pompeii. Dissection was illegal, but the examination of wounded or dying gladiators offered a frequent substitute. Hydrotherapy was popular. In a measure, the great thermae were hydrotherapeutic institutes. Carmus of Marseille made a fortune by administering cold baths. Consumptives were sent to Egypt or North Africa. Sulfur was used as a skin-specific and to fumigate rooms after an infectious disease. Drugs were a final but frequent resort. Physicians made them by processes kept secret from the public and charged for them all that patients could be persuaded to pay. Repulsive drugs were held in high honor. The offal of lizards was used as a purgative. Human entrails were sometimes prescribed. Antonius Musa recommended the excreta of dogs for angina. Galen applied a boy's dung to the swellings of the throat. In compensation for all this, a cheerful quack offered to cure almost any ailment with wine. Of the known medical writers in this age, only one was a Roman, and he was not a physician. Aurelius Cornelius Celsus was an aristocrat who about A.D. 30 gathered into an encyclopedia de artibus his studies in agriculture, war, oratory, law, philosophy, and medicine. Only the section De Medicina survives. It is the greatest work on medicine that has come down to us from the 6 centuries between Hippocrates and Galen. It has also the distinction of being written in such pure and classical Latin that Celsus was dubbed Cicero Medicorum. The Latin terms into which he translated the nomenclature of Greek medicine have ruled the science ever since. The 6th book shows considerable knowledge in antiquity of venereal disease. The 7th is an illuminating description of surgical methods. It contains the earliest known account of ligature and describes tonsillectomy, lateral lithotomy, plastic surgery, and operations for cataract. Altogether, this is the soundest achievement in Roman scientific literature, and suggests that we might have a better opinion of Roman science if Pliny had not been preserved. It is a pity that scholarship has concluded that Celsus's treatise is largely a compilation or paraphrase of Greek texts. Lost in the Middle Ages, it was rediscovered in the 15th century, was printed before Hippocrates or Galen, and took a leading part in stimulating the reconstruction of medicine in modern times. 7. Quintilian. When Vespasian established a state professorship of rhetoric in Rome, he appointed to it a man who, like so many authors of this Silver Age, was of Spanish birth. Marcus Fabius Quintilianus was born at Calagurris in possibly A.D. 35, went to Rome to study oratory, and opened a school of rhetoric there which numbered Tacitus and the younger Pliny among its pupils. Juvenal describes him in his prime as handsome, noble, wise, well-bred, with a fine voice and delivery, and a senatorial dignity. In old age he retired to write for the guidance of his son the classic treatment of his subject, the Institutio Oratoria, this in 96. I thought that this work would be the most precious part of the inheritance of my son, whose ability was so remarkable that it called for the most anxious cultivation on the part of his father. Night and day I pursued this design and hastened its completion in the fear that death might cut me off with my task unfinished. Then misfortune overwhelmed me with such suddenness that the success of my labors now interests no one less than myself. I have lost him of whom I had formed the highest expectations, and in whom I reposed all the hopes that should solace my old age. His wife had died at 19, leaving him 2 sons. One of these had died at the age of 5, robbing me, as it were, of one of my 2 eyes. Now the other went, leaving the old teacher to outlive all my nearest and dearest. He defines rhetoric as the science of speaking well. The training of the orator should begin before birth. It is desirable that he should come of educated parents, so that he may receive correct speech and good manners from the very air he breathes. It is impossible to become both educated and a gentleman in one generation. The future orator should study music to give him an ear for harmony, the dance to give him grace and rhythm, drama to animate his eloquence with gesture and action, gymnastics to keep him in health and strength, literature to form his style, train his memory, and arm him with a treasury of great thoughts, science to acquaint him with some understanding of nature, and philosophy to mold his character on the dictates of reason and the precepts of wise men. For all preparations will be of no avail unless integrity of conduct and nobility of spirit are present to generate an irresistible sincerity of speech. Then the student must write as much as possible and with the utmost care. It is a hard training, and I trust, says Quintilian, that no one among my readers will think of calculating its monetary value. The oration itself has 5 phases: conception, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Having chosen his subject and clearly conceived his purpose, let the orator gather his material from observation, inquiry, and books, and arrange it both logically and psychologically, so that each part will be in its proper place and lead as naturally to the next as in geometry. A well-organized address will consist of introduction, or exordium, proposition, proof, refutation, and peroration. The speech should be written out only if it is to be fully memorized. Otherwise, fragmentary memories of the written form will obstruct and confuse an extempore style. If it is written, it must be with care. Write quickly, and you will never write well. Write well, and you will soon write quickly. Shun the lazy luxury of dictation now so fashionable among writers. Clearness is the first essential, then brevity, beauty, and vigor. Correct repeatedly and stoically. Erasure is as important as writing. Prune what is turgid, elevate what is commonplace, arrange what is disorderly, introduce rhythm where the language is harsh, modify where it is too absolute. The best method of correction is to put aside for a time what we have written, so that when we come to it again we may have an aspect of novelty, as of being another man's work. In this way we may preserve ourselves from regarding our writings with the affection that we lavish upon a newborn child. Delivery, like composition, should touch the emotions, but avoid exuberant gesticulation. It is feeling and force of imagination that makes us eloquent, but shout and bellow with your uplifted hand, pant, wag your head, smite your hands together, slap your thigh, your breast, your forehead, and you will go straight to the heart of the dingier members of your audience. To all this excellent counsel, Quintilian adds in his 12th book the best literary criticism that has survived from antiquity. He enters with zest into the ancient and modern war between the ancients and the moderns, and finds truth precariously in the middle. He does not, like Fronto, wish to return to the rude simplicity of Cato and Ennius, but still more he would shun the voluptuous and affected fluency of Seneca. He prefers, as a model for students, the virile yet polished speech of Cicero, the one Roman writer who had in his line surpassed the Greeks. Quintilian's own style is often that of a schoolmaster, moribund with definitions, classification, and distinctions, and rising to eloquence only in denouncing Seneca. But it is a vigorous style whose dignity is lightened now and then with touches of humanity and wit. Behind the good sense of the words we feel always the quiet goodness of the man. It is a moral stimulus to read him. Perhaps the Romans, who had the privilege of his instruction, took from it some part of the moral renovation that, more than any brilliance of letters, ennobled the age of the younger Pliny and Tacitus. 8. Statius and Martial. We have left to the last two poets who belonged to the same epoch, sought the favor of the same emperor and the same patrons, yet never mention each other, one the purest, the other the coarsest poet in the history of imperial Rome. Publius Papinius Statius was the son of a Neapolitan poet and grammarian. His environment and his education gave him everything but money and genius. He lisped in numbers, startled salons with poetical improvisations, and wrote an epic, the Thebaid, on the War of the Seven against Thebes. We cannot read it today, for its movement is obstructed with dead gods, and its smooth verses have an overpowering virtus dormitiva. But his contemporaries liked it. Crowds gathered to hear him recite it in a Naples theater. They understood his mythological machinery, welcomed the delicacy of his sentiment, and found that his lines ran trippingly on the tongue. The judges in the Alban poetry contest gave him the first prize. Rich men became his friends and helped him stave off penury. Domitian himself invited him to dinner in the Domus Flavia, and Statius repaid him by describing the palace as heaven and the emperor as God. To Domitian and other patrons, to his father and his friends, he addressed the most pleasing of his poems, the Silvae, modest idyls and eulogies in light and happy verse. In the Capitoline Games, however, another poet won the crown. Statius's star waned in fickle Rome, and he persuaded his reluctant wife to return with him to his boyhood home. In Naples he began another epic, the Achilleid. Then suddenly in 96 he died, a youth of 35. He was not a great poet, but he struck a welcome note of kindliness and tenderness amid a literature too often sarcastic and bitter, and a society corrupt and coarse beyond any precedent. He would have been as famous as Martial if he had been as obscene. Marcus Valerius Martialis was born at Bilbilis in Spain in the 40th year of our era. At 24 he came to Rome and won the friendship of Lucan and Seneca. Quintilian advised him to butter his bread by practicing law, but Martial preferred to starve on poetry. His friends were suddenly swept away in the conspiracy of Piso, and he was reduced to addressing his poems to rich men who might give him a dinner for an epigram. He lived in a third-floor garret, probably alone, for though he indites two poems to a woman whom he calls his wife, they are so foul that she must have been an invention or a bawd. His poems, he lets us know, were read throughout the empire, even among the Goths. He rejoices to learn that he was almost as famous as a racehorse, but he fretted to see his publisher enriched while he himself received nothing from the sale of his books. He descended to suggesting in an epigram that he badly needed a toga. The emperor's rich freedman Parthenius sent him one. He replied in 2 stanzas, one of which celebrated the newness of the garment, the other its cheap worthlessness. In time he found some more generous patrons. One gave him a little farm at Nomentum, and somehow he raised funds to buy a simple home on the Quirinal Hill. He became a client or retainer to one rich man after another, waited upon them in the morning and received an occasional gift, but he felt the shame of his situation and mourned that he did not have the courage to be contentedly poor and therefore free. He could not afford to be poor, for he had to mingle in the society of men who could reward his verse. He showered Domitian with lauds and announced that if Jupiter and Domitian were to invite him to dinner on the same day, he would turn down the god, but the emperor preferred Statius. Martial became jealous of the younger poet and suggested that a live epigram was worth more than a dead epic. The epigram had till now been a pretty conceit on any passing subject, sometimes a dedication, a compliment, an epitaph. Martial molded it into a briefer, sharper form, barbed with satiric sting. We do him injustice when we read these 1,561 epigrams in a few sittings. They were issued in 12 books at divers times, and the reader was expected to use them in small portions as hors d'oeuvres, not as a prolonged feast. Most of them seem trivial today. Their allusion was local and temporary, too well timed to endure. Martial does not take them very seriously. The bad ones, he agrees, outnumber the good, but he had to fill a volume. He is a master of versification, knows all the meters and all the tricks of the poetic trade, but he avoids rhetoric as proudly as his prose patrician analogue Petronius. He cares nothing for the mythological furniture that littered the literature of his age. He is interested in real men and women and their intimate life, and describes them with relish and spite. "My pages," he says, "taste of men." He can take down some stiff aristocrat or stingy millionaire, some pompous lawyer or famous orator, but he likes better to tell of barbers, cobblers, hawkers, jockeys, acrobats, auctioneers, poisoners, perverts, and prostitutes. His scenes are laid not in ancient Greece, but in the baths, the theaters, the streets, the circus, the homes and tenements of Rome. He is the poet laureate of worthless men. He is more interested in money than in love, and most often thinks of the latter in one gender. There is some sentiment in him, and he speaks very tenderly of a friend's child just dead, but there is no gallant line in his books, not even a noble wrath. He chants a litany of evil smells and adds, "All these stenches I prefer to yours, Bassa." He describes one of his mistresses. "Your tresses, Galla, are manufactured far away. You lay aside your teeth at night as you do your silk dresses. You lie stored away in 100 caskets, and your face does not sleep with you. You wink with an eyebrow brought to you in the morning. No respect moves you for your outworn carcass, which you may now count as one of your ancestors." He writes with unmanly vengefulness of the women who have refused him, and flings his epigrammatic mud at them with the delicacy of a scavenger. His love lyrics are addressed to boys. He climbs to ecstasy over the fragrance of thy kisses, cruel lad. One of his love poems begot a famous English counterpart. "I do not love you, Sabitius, the reason I cannot tell. This only I can say, I dislike you very well." Indeed, there are many whom Martial does not like. He describes them under transparent pseudonyms and in language that can be found today only on the most private public walls. He is always libeling his enemies, as Statius is always celebrating his friends. Some of his victims retaliated by publishing under his name poems filthier than his own, or attacking the men whom Martial was anxious to please. From these technically perfect epigrams one could construct a full vocabulary of barroom urology. But Martial's obscenity sits on him lightly. He shares it with his time, and never doubts that even high-born maidens in palace bowers will like it. This book is continued on Cassette 11, Side 1.